Childhood neglect, the premature loss of a parent, the death of a spouse, losing your job, the feeling of being ostracized and separated from everyone you had once cared about. Every single one of these events could feel like an insurmountable hurdle for an individual to overcome in their life. But one character in Psychonauts 2 has had to live through all of this and more. Bob Zanotto is an incredibly competent man who has been dealt a very difficult hand in life, which has led him to retreat and isolate himself from the world as he copes with traumas from his past as best he can, which has in turn led him to inadvertently develop what appears to be both a major depressive disorder and an alcohol use disorder. So today we're going to explore everything about Bob's mental world to see not only how this is illustrated to us and how he has reached the point he's at today, but also so that we can recognize the strength he is able to find within himself to begin overcoming these difficulties. But before we get ahead of ourselves, did you know that less than 10% of people who watch these videos are actually subscribed to the channel? So if you enjoy these kind of Psychonauts videos, help me out to get to 20,000 subscribers before the end of the year by hitting that subscribe button. But back to the video. So as Raz is searching for a way to remove the massive plants that have infested the astrolabe, he does what anyone would do in his situation. He follows a path that's absolutely overgrown with massive plants which lead up to a gigantic and intimidating beanstalk-like plant tower. And so after climbing up this massive plant, Raz is greeted by an old run-down greenhouse which he unsurprisingly enters without a moment's hesitation. Though before we're actually able to lay eyes on Bob himself, we are immediately starting to get clues as to where Bob's head may be at, with there being a barren garden and empty bottles and a broken picture of the Psychic 7 lying right outside the door to this greenhouse. And then once we actually enter the greenhouse itself, it is just as run down on the inside as it was on the outside, with again the floor being littered with bottles and the focal point of the room being what appears to be a homemade brewing machine, which is one of our first indicators that he may be coping with an alcohol use disorder. The 5th edition of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual defines an alcohol use disorder as a problematic pattern of alcohol use leading to clinically significant impairment or distress as manifested by at least 2 symptoms occurring within a 12-month period. And so based on the fact that it appears that Bob brews all of his own alcohol, this could illustrate to us that he likely spends a lot of time every day obtaining and using alcohol. So when Bob eventually realizes that Raz has entered his greenhouse, he is not pleased to have a visitor. Immediately, Bob uses his herbophony, or the power to psychically control plants, to have a bottle thrown straight at Raz to try and scare him away before taking a swig from a flask he has stored in his beard. Essentially, Bob illustrates to us, the player, that he is struggling to attend to his own basic self-care needs, like getting new glasses so that he can properly see, changing his clothes, bathing, grooming himself, or maintaining a clean living environment, which is listed by the DSM-5 as being a functional consequence of a major depressive disorder. Instead, he favors focusing much more of his time and energy into feeding into what has likely become a dependency on alcohol. So when Raz tries to talk to him about Truman, Ford, and Helmut, he gets incredibly irritated and throws Raz out, only to have Raz sneak back in with the help of one of the plants, who gives Raz permission to enter Bob's mind, which the plant initiates by placing the door on Bob's forehead and moving him to face Raz, which he solemnly accepts. Now, before I go any further, I really want to stress the fact that what Bob is going through is by no means uncommon in the world, as I'm sure that many of the people watching right now understand all too well. And so when Raz gets the opportunity to enter Bob's mind, we are able to receive the most important thing you can have when working with people, and that's context. And so Raz finds himself on a small barren island that is only home to 3 weed-infested planters with labels that have his mother Tia's his name on it, one with Helmut Fullbear's Viking helmet, and one with the Psychonauts logo. And besides these planters, there's only an unlit campfire, a dock, and Bob Zanotto himself, surrounded by a seemingly endless body of water. It doesn't take an expert to realize that this desert island is meant to illustrate Bob's feelings of loneliness and isolation from the rest of the world. But what I'm more interested in is just how much information we're able to ascertain from Raz and Bob's first conversation. In this conversation, we can begin seeing two symptoms of Bob's potential major depressive disorder. And so I want to explain how criteria A of major depressive disorder is determined. Essentially, to be diagnosed, Bob would need at least 5 out of the 9 depressive symptoms outlined by the DSM-5 and would need to experience these to a clinically significant degree. Now, of the criteria required for a major depressive diagnosis, one symptom has to be either a depressed mood for most of the day, nearly every day, as indicated by subjective reports or observations made by others, or a markedly diminished interest or pleasure in all or almost all activities most of the day, nearly every day. And while we only really get one day with Bob, for the purpose of this video, I think it's safe to assume Double Fine is inferring that we are not seeing an isolated incident in regard to Bob's mood, and more so that this is more the norm, which would lead us to say that yes, Bob would likely qualify as having a depressed mood based on the interactions that we're having with him. And so in this conversation, the first piece of diagnostic criteria we're able to viscerally see is Bob's psychomotor retardation as he speaks, which, if you're not familiar, is defined by the American Psychological Association as being a slowing down or inhibition of mental and physical activity manifested as slow speech with long pauses before answers, slowness in thinking, and slow body movements. Whenever Bob responds to Raz, not only does he have somewhat of a muted affect, but it takes him a while, even once he's started talking, to fully articulate what he wants to say. But it should be noted that we also see another potential symptom of a major depressive disorder in this scene, which is Bob's diminished ability to think or concentrate, which is illustrated by the fact that he forgot what he had planted in these planters and struggled to remember where the seeds went, simply stating that they went somewhere out there, referencing the vast sea around them, which he has resigned himself to being trapped by. He likely does have a diminished interest in all, or at least most activities, because growing and nurturing plants was once a huge part of Bob's life prior to the loss of Helmut. Now, I think that what Double Fine did with the perspective of this portion of the level is absolutely brilliant, because while nothing in this level is really that far away in reality, everything seems very, very distant because they are out of our field of view constantly. Because in Bob's mind, everything outside of his field of view is out of reach. And so we see that when Raz goes to begin searching for the seeds, Bob asks Raz not to go, illustrating to us just how profoundly he doesn't actually want to be alone anymore. But when Raz invites him to come along with him, he refuses, instead opting to stay on his island and to stay isolated. This is interesting because in this segment of the level, as we sail around the islands collecting figments, these deserted islands aren't actually completely deserted. If we keep our eyes open, we can find Lily Zanotto, who calls him a major disappointment, even though he hasn't seen her outside pictures for years. And so he doesn't even really know what her voice should sound like. He fills in those blanks himself. We can find Truman Zanotto, who just keeps repeating the phrase, "You're fired," for reasons, again, we'll get to a little bit later. And Otto Mentalis, who Bob believes only hung around him because he and the rest of the Psychic 7 only liked him because of Helmut. In essence, all of these figures tie in with why he has isolated himself from the world. It has been found in numerous studies that depression is often linked with low self-esteem and low self-concept. And so these mental constructs of people on these deserted islands don't really really convey reality in any way, shape, or form, but instead Bob has used a defense mechanism known as projection, which is the process by which one attributes one's own individual positive or negative characteristics, affects, and impulses onto another person or group. So instead of Bob saying that he believes he's good for nothing, he instead has projected this belief onto Lily. Bob was insecure that no one in the Psychic 7 actually liked him, and so he has Otto saying these words to him in his mind. All of this to say, I think that these feelings could definitely fall into the category of feelings of worthlessness, which is another potential facet of Bob's major depressive disorder. But while these three are meant to be stumbled upon in Bob's mind, these mental manifestations only scratch the surface of what Bob has repressed, shoved down, and for lack of a more apt term, bottled up. So the first island you're actually supposed to head to is home to a large pink bottle that, when uncorked, leads to an uneven representation of Bob's childhood kitchen. Although the floor is a bit windy and uneven, nothing seems too out of the ordinary, barring a figment of a bottle on the counter. So once Raz reaches the opposite end of the room and is able to get outside through the fridge, he sees the seed that he's looking for being held in the palm of a giant statue of Bob with a moth on the face that begins discouraging Raz from taking the seed by saying this.
Hey! Hold it right there.
Why?
I wouldn't want you to get hurt.
How could that little thing hurt me?
Oh, they always start out little, don't they? And then they grow and cause so much pain. Here, let me just take this somewhere safe.
Wait, no, I want that.
No, you don't!
Now, this is potentially one of the most interesting illustrations of why Bob uses alcohol in the way that he does. Essentially, the seeds in Bob's mind represent relationships with the people that mean the most to him in his life, but in turn have hurt him the larger that they grew. And so, to avoid getting hurt, the moth watches over these small seeds of light in his mind so that they don't get planted in his garden again, and in turn will hypothetically protect Bob from getting hurt again. But if you're anything like I was, you might be wondering, why a moth? Well, moths, while obviously being attracted to light, are also attracted to alcohol. I think that as Raz is inside this bottle seeking to free the seeds of these relationships that Bob has made such a point to bottle up and push out of sight, the moth is representing Bob's tendency towards even yet another defense mechanism, which is escapism through alcohol. Instead of dealing with any issues head on, Bob, like the moth, will move towards alcohol and push any bad thoughts or memories as far down as possible. And so the moth flees further into this portion of the mental area with the seed, with Raz navigating a bog-like terrain in pursuit. However, instead of water, this area has a carbonated liquid, likely being some kind of cocktail if the strawberries everywhere are any indication. And in turn, this is where we are introduced to Bulb Bob, which illustrates to us, the player, how Bob likely sees himself as he's intoxicated. This is indicated by the constant belching and somewhat slurred and unfiltered speech of Bob. In essence, the in-game mechanic of these Bulb Bobs is to repel the liquid around them, which makes for some fun and unique timing-based platforming challenges, but if we look a little bit deeper at what this could mean at a more personal level for Bob, it's likely that he, at least at an unconscious level, realizes that his drinking habits push everything and everyone away from him, except for Raz, who is the only person who has taken the initiative to support him. And so as Raz moves through this segment, the Bob Bulbs will uncover a lot of platforms for Raz to use use to get across this body of alcohol. And oftentimes these platforms will be just more giant bottles of alcohol that have been drowned. And as the level goes on, we slowly start to see what appears to be Bob's perception of his home falling into disarray, with images of dishes stacked everywhere, and the regret enemy types showing up more and more often, with the occasional voice of Bob pleading with his mother appearing more and more often until we are able to reach the point in the level where we see giant statues of Bob Zanotto and his mother Tia Zanotto. And this first set of statues is particularly interesting because Tia is watering a pink carnation. And I point this out because if you think back to our trip to this bottle, the path through the water that guided us consisted entirely of these pink carnations, which are commonly used to represent gratitude and a mother's love, showing to us that Bob, even now, is grateful to his mother and loves her dearly. So as we continue moving through this garden of statues, we are moving towards the greenhouse, as a concerned Bob keeps asking his mother why she's going out to the greenhouse every night and what she does for so long out there. And it's here that we see why he has repressed this memory. Raz walks through an overgrown kitchen in shambles with countless bottles pointing towards a hole in the ground that takes us to the greenhouse, where Raz, again surrounded by bottles that are emptying their contents into a pit, has to fight one of Bob's bad moods, which, based on the setting that we fight it in, is something that Bob has clearly tried to drown out with alcohol. And once Raz is able to defeat the bad mood, it's here that he sees exactly what happened in the greenhouse. But to understand this better, I want to first talk about Bob's first memory vault. This vault gives us a lot more insight into Bob and his mother's relationship straight away, as they are sadly eating dinner alone with a picture of what we can infer to be his late father on the wall behind them. Then after dinner, Bob sees his mother leaving the house as he's washing dishes, and she stays there until after he has already gone to bed. It's clear that Bob knows something is wrong, but being a child, he doesn't do anything about it. We then flash forward and see a much older Bob Zanotto standing over his late mother's grave with no one but a priest accompanying him to speak at her burial. It is from here that he finally goes back to look in her greenhouse, and through his psychic connection with plants, he discovers what she had been doing for all those years of his childhood. She was quite literally drinking herself into an early grave out of the sheer grief of losing her husband. And while it is irrefutable to say that she was going through a very tough time in her life, and alcohol likely seemed like the only escape for her at this moment, this in turn appears to have led to her neglecting a young Bob, who, based on the photo by his bed, was likely also having a difficult time coping with the loss of his father. And as she spent more and more time drinking in the greenhouse, the less and less attention Bob was likely receiving from her throughout the formative years of his life. According to the counseling center at Cornell College, adult children of alcoholics often experience some of the following. They will also abuse alcohol or have problems with alcohol use. They may struggle with interpersonal relationships. They could have trouble with anger management, low self-esteem, and inability to trust feelings of guilt, and be at a heightened risk for depressive symptoms. Now, of course, none of this is guaranteed, but having a parent who struggles with this alcohol abuse may heighten these attributes in these children as they grow into adulthood. And Bob is unfortunately a perfect example of this. Because his mother tried to drown out her sorrows with alcohol, she in turn created even more grief for her son. Raz discovers in the deepest depths of this first bottle what appears to be a church, but instead of pews, there are planters full of countless empty bottles of alcohol, and a plant like Tia laying alone on the altar. And it's from this spot in this first bottle that we are able to recover the first seed for Bob, which, when planted, creates a small plant-like version of his mother Tia. And with this seed planted, another bottle that Bob has shoved down resurfaces, this time with a cork emblazoned with the Psychonauts logo, and having a new path of flowers leading to it. This time, however, the flowers aren't carnations, but instead are black dahlias, which, while most colors of dahlia flowers have much more positive meanings, the black dahlia symbolizes betrayal, sadness, and other negative emotions, which once we begin progressing through this next bottle, this makes a lot more sense why these flowers would lead there. When we enter this bottle in Bob's mind, we realize that the events that occur in these bottles are not arranged chronologically, but instead they're based on how far these moments in his life have been shoved down and avoided through his drinking, because we are introduced immediately to a wrecked Viking ship with several figments of Bob seemingly marooned on this sinking ship, and a figment of Helmut Fullbear's helmet at the front of the ship, illustrating that he feels stranded without Helmut after the notorious Battle of Grulovia. But after the moth taunts us, hinting that relationships are the cause of pain, referring to them as bombs, we enter the ship and end up in a drowned version of the mother lobe, where again, we can begin getting some more insight into what Bob had thought of this area of his life. It's here we fight another bad mood, showing us that he's likely not too fond of his memories in the mother lobe, which would also explain why a lot of censors are after us. But after we fight an enabler, which could very well mean that while his drinking habits may have pushed some people away, there may have been many people in the mother lobe who are enabling these behaviors, as is referenced by the random figments of men who are vomiting, which we can infer is due to the effects of alcohol, and various other people in the mother lobe who are drinking show us that there may have been a culture of drinking, which in moderation wouldn't be the worst unless you are predisposed to substance abuse and just lost the love of your life. And so as we progress through the level, seemingly set up to make us fall and fail at every turn, which is what I imagine it must have felt like to Bob as he was trying to navigate working for the Psychonauts, even though it felt as though he was drowning, with a symptom of alcohol use disorder being the recurrent use of alcohol resulting in a failure to fill major role obligations at work, school, or home. We eventually reach Truman's office, where we hear this.
Fired? You can't fire me! I helped create this place! Recruited by Ford Crawler himself! No pipsqueak nephew's gonna fire me! What do you mean, what's happened to me? What's happened to you? What's this phone number? I'm not gonna call some stranger. I don't need help! I just need my job! I made some mistakes, but so has everybody! Yes, people were hurt, but no one died. It worked out in the end. Why are you all attacking me? You're my own blood. Why aren't you on my side? Truman, how could you?
And suddenly the black dahlias representing betrayal all make so much sense. Bob clearly feels betrayed by his nephew Truman for firing him for drinking too much on the job. And this leads us to another relevant symptom of an alcohol use disorder, which is the adverse and causal effect that drinking has on social, occupational, and recreational life. Because of his drinking habits, he was fired from the place he helped create by his own family nonetheless. And finally, after giving a non-responsive Bob the seed from the second bottle, the third and by far the largest bottle erupts from the sea with a path of what appear to be marigolds leading up to it. And this is interesting because while the marigold flower is known to represent positive emotions like joy or affection, illustrating that within this bottle there may be some fond memories, the marigold has also come to symbolize a feeling of despaired love, often brought on by someone who has lost someone that they love, whether it be by death or a broken relationship. And this could not be more accurate if it had tried to be, as this bottle heavily focuses on Bob and Helmut's wedding. So after Raz crashes through the sealed bottom of the bottle, showing us that this is a memory that Bob has tried to push down and protect more than anything else in his mind. We can turn right and see a long table set for countless people, likely meant to illustrate to us the rehearsal dinner table for Bob and Helmut's wedding. And so from here, we can continue forward where we'll see the moth, which is suspiciously shaped like Bob's face, take the seed again as we follow it through a tunnel comprised of several layers of cake before reaching the wedding reception, where we can find figments of Ford, Lucy, Compton, and Cassie at the guest tables, Bob and Helmut of course, and notably Truman Zanotto, who appears to be giving a toast, which makes me think that he could have been Bob's best man, which would add an additional layer to the pain Bob felt after being fired by Truman. And on top of all of this, the dance floor is inhabited by a bad mood, censors, and a couple of bad ideas, illustrating to us that perhaps Bob on some level believes that getting married to Helmut was a bad idea because of all the pain he has felt since losing him in the Battle of Grulovia. Now, I think it's pretty safe to say that Bob loved Helmut more than anything. There's a reason that this memory was shoved down further than any of the others, because with Helmut, I think it's undeniable that Bob appears to be the happiest, with the figments of them two appearing together pretty consistently in each other's minds. And so as Raz progresses towards these massive statues representing Bob's proposal to Helmut, we pass by swords that indicate Bob's deepest desire to be together forever and to never be apart. And as we encounter our final Bob bulb, he states that he doesn't want to ruin anything before burping and revealing the skull of Helmut Fullbear, illustrating to us that he feels responsible for what happened to Helmut during the battle for Grulovia. And if we look at his memory vault that can be found earlier in the level, we can see exactly what is to be expected. That the catalyst that brought Bob to the place he is at today was losing Helmut in that bottle. And so after mourning the loss of his beloved husband, he lost his job and headed back to the Green Needle Gulch to do exactly what his mother did when she lost her spouse. He isolated himself from the world and drank to forget, bottling everything up so that he doesn't have to feel the pain of everything that has happened to him in his life. And while these coping mechanisms are incredibly maladaptive with the context given by all of Bob's bottles, it's hard to blame him for getting to this point. After Helmut's death, we see in the memory vault Bob standing at the grave entirely alone. And so, with no support system to be found to keep himself afloat, Bob turned to the only thing he could think of to numb the pain. Again, something we see so often in the world. However, with alcohol being a depressant, while it may provide a perceived momentary reprieve, it was this coping mechanism that caught him in a cycle of substance abuse, because once it wears off, he knows he'll probably feel even worse than before, which makes him drink more and more and more. And so as Raz enters the mouth of Helmut's skull, we are able to see one of the most sincere and tragically heartwarming scenes in the entire game, where we hear the voice of Bob saying his vows to an unresponsive Helmut in front of Helmut's van. It hurts that this moment in time has been pushed as far back in Bob's mind as it can go, because this was likely the moment he was truly the happiest man alive. Though now, to Bob, it's just less painful to try and forget it. Sometimes I wonder what would have been different had Truman taken a bit more of an empathetic approach when working with his uncle. Would things have been different had he had a true support system? I'm inclined to believe that they may have been. As we go through the minds of many of the Psychic Six, I really think it shines a light on the flaws of the Psychonauts as an organization itself. At the beginning of the game, Hollis Forsythe says this:
"The Psychonauts. We're not here to change people's minds, Raz. Not here to fix people. We're here to help people fight their own demons. The ones they already have.
And so if this is the case, who was there to help Bob, one of their founders, fight his demons? How could this organization that should be built upon empathetic understanding be so dismissive of one of their own? And this just doesn't go for Bob. The same could be said about everyone whose mind we enter in this game. How is it that one 10-year-old boy has the ability to provide some of the greatest psychics in the world the support that they needed to successfully begin the process of confronting their personal demons, while the leaders of this massive entity let them all stew for years despite blatantly apparent cries for help? And while I could go into much more detail regarding the flaws of the Psychonauts as an organization, that's a topic for another day. When Raz finally delivers the final seed, Bob begins remembering everything that he had pushed down, which causes the plants to grow into giant monsters. And this boss fight has absolutely no shortage of symbolism in it, based on how Bob has come to view all of these relationships. The Tia flower fights by sending missiles at Bob and says lines like "just another dead soldier," both likely being references to his father, who we can infer died in war. The Truman flower breathes fire on the battlefield, which I think is likely a reference to the fact that when Bob was fired, it was Truman's words that hurt him the most. And finally, the helmet plant sends massive tomatoes to block his path, which I thought was a bit weird until I started looking into what on earth this could possibly be a reference to. And while I found a variety of answers online, the one that makes the most sense given the context of the game itself is that these tomatoes likely symbolize love, with the French even referring to them as such in the past due to their belief that the tomato has aphrodisiac qualities. And so the fact that Helmut is throwing these tomatoes is likely meant to represent how the love Bob had found blew up in his face. And so over the course of the battle, while Raz is fighting these massive plants, the moth is constantly in Bob's ear trying to protect him from experiencing the pain of the past so that he doesn't have to feel anything, mimicking the effect that alcohol would have on him. However, Bob begins to snap out of his depressive state when he hears this.
Love? I don't really love him. If I did, how could I have left him all alone?
Helmut would never say that.
Though the moth doubles down on trying to protect him from the pain, it's apparent that Bob does not want its quote-unquote help anymore. And so finally, once Raz is able to defeat the boss, Bob is able to take the moth off of his face that had been blinding him for so long and give gardening and tending to his relationships another try, as the two of them look out upon an ocean full of seeds for Bob to tend to. I believe that Bob's Bottles is one of the most poignant and impactful levels in the entire game because it tackles difficulties that so many people cope with on a day-to-day basis. But if we can take anything from this mind, and really all of the minds in Psychonauts, it's that sometimes we just need some support. Bob had fully resigned himself to live in this greenhouse alone, with his only method of coping with the past being to drink until the pain was numbed. And had Raz not come along, who knows what would have happened to him. And while no one should ever force help onto someone against their will, sometimes the people who need the most support are the ones who will be the least likely to ask. Alcoholism and major depressive disorders are undeniably difficult to cope with, but are often pushed under the rug by society, and instead of seeking help or support, people will be coerced into putting on a mask for the people around them, just like Bob. And so this is why I love Psychonauts 2, because while characters like Bob Zanotto are irrefutably incredible people, it shows that anyone, regardless of who they are, can struggle. And while it can be tempting to rely only on yourself and self-medicate to make yourself feel better, oftentimes reaching out to someone you know you can trust or talking to a mental health professional is going to be the better course of action. And so after we exit Bob's mind, we see him getting rid of all of the equipment he had been using for so long to feed his addiction, ready to take his first steps into true recovery. And while I'm sure that the road from here will not be easy, it's one that I'm sure that he has the strength to continue forward on. But that'll do it for this week's video, guys, and I want to pass the question off to you. What are your thoughts on Bob's Bottles, and did I miss anything? And what mental world would you like me to cover from Psychonauts next? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comment section down below. And while you're down there, make sure to subscribe to the channel so that we can reach 20,000 subscribers by the end of the year. And as always, I hope you have a fantastic rest of your day, a fantastic rest of your week, and why not even a fantastic rest of your month. And I will see you in the next video. Later.